So in 2007, Oxford Junior Dictionary removed about 50 nature words. These were words such as bluebell, willow, and kingfisher. And this decision by the dictionary was widely criticized. But in fact, that was a decision based on an analysis of children's language use. Words that children did not use as much had to go to make for room for words that they were more likely to use these days. So words such as blog and broadband and voicemail. Now, the dictionary had only gone where the children had gone before them. And it wasn't only the dictionary editors who noticed children's attention shifting away from nature. A few years earlier, some researchers found that an average 8-year-old child in Britain could identify 78% of all Pokemon characters. In contrast, they could identify only 53% of wildlife species common in Britain. So they were more likely to be able to identify Pikachu and Charmander than they were able to name a robin. So both the researchers and the dictionary editors documented nature fading from children's attention and from their vocabulary, and that seems to be symptomatic of a broader phenomenon. The phenomenon being that children's connection to nature is weakening. To study this question of our connection to nature over time, how it has changed, and to scientifically being able to answer, are today's children really less disconnected from nature than were their parents? And were their parents less connected to nature than their own parents? We need evidence, we need data, and this is where we hit a challenge. The challenge is about measurement. So how do we measure connection to nature going back in time? Now, we cannot go back in time with our questionnaires, and we cannot ask a child in 1935 whether she is able to identify a robin, or whether she enjoys spending time in nature, or how much time she spends in nature. So it's a tough question to be able to answer, and that is where my sister and fellow co-author, Selin Kesebir, and me had an insight. And our insight was this: we cannot go back in time and interview people who are no longer alive, but we can take a look at the cultural products that these people have left behind. So we can look at the song lyrics they have written, we can look at the books they have written, and those cultural products can give us a sense of how connected they were to nature, because the words they use are not random. So if these cultural creators care about nature, if they notice nature, if they consider nature worth talking about, if they assume that their audiences would be interested in hearing about nature, then they would be more likely to put nature in their works. So they would be more likely to use nature words in their songs or in their novels. So that was our ideas, and we set out to systematically track how often nature-related words would appear in cultural products. So we analyzed about millions of books digitized by Google using the Google Books database. We covered the period from 1900 to 2000. We also examined about 6,000 song lyrics from 1950 to 2011, every song that made it to the Billboard Hot 100. And we also analyzed movie storylines, covering 85 years, about 274,000 movie storylines that we had retrieved from IMDb. And the idea, again, was the number of nature words in these cultural products should give us a sense of the connection that their creators felt to nature. So the more nature-related words they used, the more they would be connected to nature. That was our presumption. And to test this idea, we also created 186 words. We created a list with 186 words about nature. So this list contained words such as sunset, meadow, lark, bluebell, willow, kingfisher, lily, violet, daisy, and summer and spring. So many, many words about nature, and we tracked the frequency of these words in these cultural products over time. And we did find a consistent pattern. What we found was that after the 1950s, nature words have been slowly disappearing from our cultural products. So this effect was consistent across all the three media that we have studied, but it was most striking in song lyrics. So when we compare the first decade in our database of song lyrics, the 1950s, and the last decade that we have in our database, the first decade of the 2000s, we find a 63% decline in references to nature. So that means that for every one word in a popular song of the 2000s, there were slightly more than 3 words in a popular song in 1950s. And to give you a sense of what that would look like, I would like to share with you the songs of a song from 1957, a song that was very popular then, and this song talks about the purple dusk of twilight stealing across the meadows of the singer's heart and little stars climbing up the sky. So this almost feels quaint today, but it also speaks to a different sensibility. It tells us about a time when nature seems to take up more space in the imagination of the people of the time. When we looked at fiction books, the pattern was also revealing, because in our fiction books database, we also had data from the first half of the century, and we found that in the first half of the century, 20th century, there was actually no change in references to nature. There were even some categories of words, such as bird names, that did increase a little bit over that period. But when we look at what happens after 1950s, we see a very clear, very gradual decline, a strong negative correlation with time, and year by year, we notice references to nature dropping from cultural products. So when we, for example, compare what happened in the first half of the century versus second half of the country, 3 names dropped by 22%, flower names dropped by 23%. We found a very similar pattern for movie storylines, and overall, we concluded that people's connection to nature has started to weaken after the 1950s. And here, some of you may be wondering, is that necessarily about our connection to nature? Could that be about something else? Maybe culture changed, culture shifted, and maybe after the 1950s, the culture became more abstract or more conceptual. Or maybe these artists, these creators are no longer referring to nature as much because people are not paying that much attention to the external world. Maybe people started to pay more attention to their inner worlds, to their minds. We tested this possibility. By creating a list of words covering the human-built environment. So words such as building, brick, bridge, room, table, furniture, window, door. And we looked at the pattern of this set of words in the same databases that we had studied before, and we found that they did not decline in their frequency over the same period. Depending on which medium we were looking at, some of them had in fact increased, and some of them just stayed the same. So what we have then is a specific change in references to nature, and that seems to suggest that people have been drifting apart from nature somewhere around the 1950s. And this raises the question of what is so special about the 1950s. Our data does not directly speak to that question, but our data is more consistent with some explanations than others. Now, one explanation for why people have grown apart from nature is urbanization. And our data is not very consistent with this explanation because urbanization rates in the English-speaking world have been largely steady throughout the 20th century. So it probably is not about urbanization. The other explanation is about nature being replaced by other technologies, such as television in 1950s, video games in the 70s, then the internet in the 90s, as a primary source of entertainment, wonder, and recreation. And that explanation aligns better with our data. Now, if our connection to nature has weakened, is that something we should care about? Is that something we should worry about? Is that something that we should start to change? The answer is probably yes, because we do know that a sense of connection to nature is essential to human well-being. So we do know that people who are connected to nature and people who spend more time in nature also report more happiness, more vitality, and more meaning in their lives. We do know that when people live near green spaces, they have greater mental health. We do know that when hospital patients have trees in their views, or when they have plants or flowers in their hospital rooms, they have more quick recoveries. They heal faster. And when we spend time in nature, our attention improves and our mental fatigue decreases. And we also know that office workers with nature views report less stress and they report greater job satisfaction. So it seems very clear from the data that we have that being connected to nature and spending time in nature are very good for our well-being and also for our health. But it's not just about our own well-being. Our connection to nature also has implications for the future of our planet, because, as David Attenborough said, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. And this idea is supported by lots of research. We do know that people who feel a stronger connection to nature also have stronger protective attitudes towards nature, more pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. And that means that if we want to escape a vicious cycle where people don't care about nature and destroy nature, which means then fewer experiences and less caring for nature, we need to build deeper connections to nature. Now, I want to share here one piece of very recent research that is giving me some hope if we want to escape this cycle. And this is research by Miles Richardson, and his question was, where does our sense of connection to nature come from? Where does children's sense of connection to nature come from? And one option is that it comes from being in green spaces. It comes from being out there in the natural world. He found that that was a factor, but it wasn't the biggest factor. The biggest predictor of children's connection to nature is their parents' connection to nature. So what that means is that the next generation is not only going to inherit a planet from us, but they are also going to inherit our relationship to it. Now, this means that if we can build a stronger connection to nature, so will they. And I can fill this last slide of mine with all the things that we could do to build a stronger connection to nature, but I want to just leave you with a single idea. When we meet someone, when we get to know a person, we learn their name first. Before there is a relationship, affection, care, there is their name. And it's the strangers whose name we can't tell. And if we cannot name a tree outside our window, or a bird we hear singing every morning, or a flower that keeps returning every spring, then they are also strangers to us, right? They may be pleasant, but we are still keeping them at a distance from ourselves. So if we want to build more intimate connections with nature, what we can do is start by learning the names of these strangers and sharing our knowledge, our appreciation, our interest for nature with others, and especially with the younger generation. Now, all those words that have disappeared from our dictionaries, our songs, our novels, they are still out there. Like, we can bring them back to life, to our lives, and to our cultural products if we individually start to use those names. Thank you.